The first week I came back to my mother's place, I told everyone in town the same thing. Just here to settle things. I said it to the woman at the feed store while she rang up dog food and a box of nails. I said it to the guy at the county office when I picked up probate forms. I said it to my sister on the phone, to my old high school friend Travis when he drove up in his mud-splashed Tacoma, even to Blue, my old border collie, as if he cared about legal timelines. "Couple months, buddy," I told him, scratching the white blaze between his eyes while he leaned his head into my leg. "Then we'll figure out what's next." That was 3 winters ago. Now, I sleep in my mother's old sewing room because the floor in the master bedroom dips toward the north wall and makes my back hurt. Her folding table is still in the corner with a jar of bent pins and cloudy buttons, and there's a pale rectangle on the wall where her calendar used to hang. I keep meaning to repaint. I keep meaning to do a lot of things. Most mornings I wake before daylight because the pipes groan, and for one dumb second I forget she's gone and expect to hear her kettle whistle and the scrape of her chair across the kitchen linoleum. Then the silence settles back in like wet wool. On the dresser sits her photograph in a cheap silver frame. Church dress, hair pinned up, smiling like she knows something patient and private. I talk to that picture more than I talk to anyone alive. "I fixed the east gutter," I said to her one morning in October, tightening my bootlaces on the edge of the bed. "And the roofer says we can make it through one more season if I keep the moss down." Blue huffed from his blanket. "Don't look at me like that," I told him. "You heard him too." Blue did not look up. He was 13 and had learned to save his opinions for things that mattered, like bacon. I carried my coffee through the house, stepping over stacked boxes labeled "Keep, Sell, Donate" in my own blocky handwriting. The labels had gone soft and curled at the corners from damp air. The truth was, I hadn't opened most of them in a year. Sorting had turned into preserving by neglect. If I didn't touch her things, they stayed exactly where she left them, and I could pretend I was being practical instead of scared. Outside, the Cascades sat under low cloud, the ridgelines layered in grey like folded flannel. The homestead looked smaller than it had when I was a kid and more stubborn. Cedar siding bleached by decades, leaning fence. Orchard rows thinned to a few old trees still bearing out of habit more than vigour. Behind it all, the tree line, fir and hemlock crowding close, dark enough at noon to make your eyes adjust. That edge of woods was where my mother swore the tall neighbour kept watch. She said it the same way she said grace at supper, plain and certain, not spooky, not dramatic, matter of fact. "Leave a little something at the cedar stump," she would say, setting down cornbread to cool. "Good neighbours deserve good manners." I rolled my eyes every time. "Mum, raccoons deserve good manners," I'd say. "And maybe black bears. That's all that's out there." She would smile without arguing, like she knew I was young and proud and temporarily stupid. Maybe so. Leave it anyway. I didn't leave anything then. I left for college, then work, then a marriage that lasted less time than her old cast-iron skillet. I came home mostly for funerals and roof patches, and one rush Thanksgiving where I spent half the day on work calls and snapped at her for saving string in coffee cans like it was still 1962. The last thing I said to her in person before she went into the hospital for what everyone called a routine procedure was, "You don't have to make stories out of everything." I had meant the neighbour. She had meant the world. After she died, those words stuck in me like fishbone. By late afternoon, the rain started up, a fine needling drizzle that darkened the porch boards and woke the smell of wet cedar. I split kindling under the lean-to, stacked it by the back door, fed the hens, checked the latch twice because coyotes had been bold that week. I moved through chores like a man trying to earn his own sleep. At 6, I heated canned chili, crumbled crackers into it, and ate standing at the counter. Blue got his kibble with a spoonful of leftover roast drippings I'd thawed from the freezer. He licked the bowl clean and looked up at me, hopeful. "No, you cannot have my cornbread," I said. I had made it that morning from my mother's recipe card: cornmeal, buttermilk, bacon grease in the skillet till it hissed. I sliced a square and put it on a chipped plate with half an apple, cut into thin moons. Blue watched me carry it to the back door. "You think I'm ridiculous, huh?" I asked him. His ears tipped forward. He was willing to accompany me in any nonsense as long as there was a chance of falling food. The path to the cedar stump had gone mossy and slick. My boots sank into last year's needles. At the edge of the trees, the air cooled fast, and the creek below sounded louder than it should have. Water combing over stones with that endless, patient noise that makes a person feel both soothed and very small. The stump itself was broad and flattened with age, rings still visible under lichen. My mother called it the table. I set down the plate and stood there a moment, hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets. I felt foolish. I also felt like if I didn't do this, some remaining thread between us would snap clean. So I cleared my throat and said to the trees, quietly, "For the tall neighbour, if there is one." I added, after a beat, "And sorry it took me this long." No thunder split the sky. No mysterious answer. Just rain ticking off fir branches and Blue shaking water from his coat. Back on the porch, I sat on the top step with a blanket over my knees and watched darkness fill the yard from the corners in. The porch light made a yellow cone that stopped just short of the stump. Beyond that, black trunks and wet leaves and nothing I could name. I told myself I was not waiting for anything. At 10, I went to bed. At dawn, the plate was licked clean. I told myself raccoons had tidy manners. The days kept stacking, one into another. Probate papers, fence repairs, wood smoke in my jacket. Phone calls from my sister that always began practical and ended tender in a way that made my throat tight. "Dean," she said one Sunday evening, "it's okay if you can't keep it all." I know. You don't have to prove anything. I know. There was a pause full of everything we didn't say. "You eating?" she asked finally. "Mostly. Sleeping?" "Some." She sighed. "Mom would have liked having you there." I leaned against the mudroom sink and stared out at the rain-streaked window. I should have listened more when she was here. Another pause, softer this time. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen a while with Blue pressed against my shins, his weight warm and steady. I reached for the photograph on the windowsill and turned it toward me. "You hear that?" I said to my mother's smile. "We're trying." That night, I left pears from the orchard instead of apples. The night after, a heel of bread and a spoonful of blackberry jam from the last jar she canned. I stopped thinking of it as proving anything. It became a shape my day took, like banking the fire or checking the coop. Apology repeated in edible form. By the time November came, the air had sharpened enough that my breath smoked by 4 in the afternoon. Frost rimed the porch rail. The hens puffed themselves into round, resentful bundles. Blue moved slower, especially on his back legs. But he still followed me everywhere, toenails clicking in the hallway like a second clock. On the first truly cold night, the kind where the sky goes iron hard and sound carries forever, I set out cornbread and sliced apples again and returned to the steps with Blue tucked against my hip. The moon was only a sliver, caught in the branches above the orchard. Frost made every weed stem white and brittle. Usually there was noise, an owl somewhere upslope, branches rubbing, Blue's occasional low woof at things he sensed before I did. That night, there was almost nothing. No owl, no creak somehow, though I knew it still ran. No sigh of wind through fir boughs. The quiet was so complete it felt padded, deliberate, as if the whole property were holding its breath. Blue noticed first. He lifted his head from my boot and stared toward the cedar stump, ears pricked, body still. Not alarmed, alert. "You see something," I whispered. He gave a single, slow thump of his tail and kept looking. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Every rational part of me started offering explanations. Temperature inversion, snow pressure in the high trees, a coyote passing through and silencing everything else. But beneath that, deeper and older, was a sensation I had no better word for than presence. Not threatening, just near. I didn't stand up, didn't turn on the floodlight, didn't call out. I sat with my hands wrapped around a mug gone cold and let the dark be dark. After a long while, Blue sighed, stood, and nosed the door. We went inside. I slept badly, waking at each creak of the house, then drifting again. At first light, I pulled on boots and stepped into a yard glazed silver with frost. My breath clouded. Blue trotted ahead of me, stiff but eager, and stopped at the stump. The plate was empty as always, but beside it, set carefully on the cedar's flat top, was a small bundle wrapped in broadleaf maple. Sweetgrass tied it shut in a neat braid. When I untied it, my fingers clumsy with cold, the scent rose up rich and peppery and unmistakable. Chanterelles, fresh, cleaned, golden as small lanterns in the morning grey. I just stood there, the leaf in my hands, while the cold bit through my jeans and the world slowly resumed its sounds. The creek finding its voice again. A raven cracking open the sky with one rough call. Blue's tags faintly chiming as he shifted. Blue sat down beside me and thumped his tail against the frozen ground. Once, twice. Patient as a friend waiting for me to catch up. "Okay," I said out loud, though my voice shook. "Okay." Then, because manners were manners, and my mother had been right about that much at least, I swallowed hard and added, "Thank you." I stayed there longer than made sense, fingers numb around the maple leaf wrap, looking from the chanterelles to the empty plate, and back again, like one of them might explain the other if I stared hard enough. Blue leaned into my knee. "You knew," I said to him. His ears flicked back, innocent as a saint in a stained glass window. "Don't do that face. You knew something." He stood and put one paw on the stump, not touching the mushrooms, just resting there like he was claiming witness. Then he looked up at me, eyes bright in the thin morning light, and gave a low whine that sounded less anxious than insistent. "All right," I said. "Inside." I carried the bundle in both hands like it might bruise. In the kitchen, I set it on the counter beneath the window and just breathed it in. Cold air still clung to the leaves, sharp and damp, but under that was the smell of earth warmed by sun, pepper and apricot and wet cedar needles. Not grocery store mushroom smell, not something dropped by a neighbor running late and laughing at me from his truck. For a minute, I went looking for practical explanations like a man patting his pockets for lost keys. Maybe Travis was messing with me. Maybe one of the kids from down road had heard old stories and decided to play woodland elf. Maybe I'd forgotten I foraged them myself in some grief fugue and tied sweetgrass in my sleep. I turned the little braid over between my fingers. Tight, even, deliberate. The knot had been cinched, then tucked. Whoever tied it knew how to tie for transport, not decoration. Blue sat by the back door, not begging breakfast, not sniffing around for scraps, just watching the tree line through the glass. "That's new," I muttered. Usually by this time he'd be orbiting the pantry like a furry moon, reminding me food existed. That morning he ignored the rattle of kibble in his metal scoop until I called his name twice. Blue. He looked at me, looked back at the door. Seriously? I carried his bowl over and set it down by his paws. Eat. He took 3 polite bites and returned to his post. I stood there holding the empty scoop, listening to the furnace kick on and off, hearing my own heartbeat in my ears. Then I laughed once, short and strange. Okay, I said to the room. This is normal. Dog is haunted by table manners and I'm arguing with a mushroom. On the dresser in the sewing room, my mother smiled from her silver frame, as if this was exactly the kind of thing she'd expected me to say. I brought the chanterelles into her room and held them up like evidence in court. You seeing this? I asked. The smile in the photo did not change, but I could hear her anyway, plain as day. Good neighbors deserve good manners. Yeah, I said softly. I heard you the first 50 times. Back in the kitchen, I cleaned the mushrooms with a damp cloth, just like she taught me when I was 9 and impatient with anything that took longer than 10 seconds. Don't drown them, Dean. They're not dishes. Respect the thing that fed you. I sliced half into ribbons and fried them in butter with 2 eggs and a pinch of thyme I'd dried in September. The smell filled the kitchen fast, rich and woodsy. Blue finally came over and sat beside me, posture impeccable. You're back among the living, I see. He accepted 1 tiny piece from my palm, chewed thoughtfully, then looked offended I hadn't offered more. Doctor's orders, I said. Old men and rich breakfasts don't mix. I plated mine and ate at the table instead of standing at the counter. Outside, the frost softened and dripped from the eaves. The creek had its voice back, bright and busy. A pair of jays tore through the orchard, raising hell at nothing. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning. But every ordinary thing had a thin new edge, like a glass I hadn't noticed was cracked until light hit it right. By noon, I'd checked 2 fence lines, tightened the coop latch, and restacked the tarp over the east woodpile. I kept finding my eyes pulled to the tree line, especially the gap near the cedar stump. I'd turn away on purpose, then look back without meaning to, the way you keep checking a rearview mirror after almost getting hit. At one point I caught myself carrying on a running monologue like I used to when Blue was young and needed constant narration not to eat baling twine. Need to patch that lower run before freezing rain, I told him, hammering a staple into post wire. And if this weather holds, we should clear the ditch tomorrow. Don't let me forget. Blue, 10 feet away, was not listening. He stood pointed toward the woods, tail level, mouth closed. Not rigid, not hackles up, just intent. What is it? He glanced back at me, then forward again. You're not making this easy. He took 3 steps toward the trees, stopped, and waited. Something moved in the fir shadows, maybe only light shifting through branches, but the hair along my forearms lifted anyway. I waited for fear and got something else. Anticipation, maybe. A held breath. Hey, I called, surprising myself with how gentle it came out. I got the mushrooms. They were good. Silence, then one dry click of branch against branch. Blue's tail gave one slow sweep. He turned around and trotted back to me as if the errand was complete. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in low and heavy, the kind that flattened distance. I made biscuits, more out of nerves than hunger, and while they baked, I stood at the sink with my hands braced on either side and watched sleet begin to stipple the mud. I talked myself through the options. Option 1, stop. Say thank you once and quit before I slide into full mountain recluse folklore. Option 2, continue and accept that I am, at 42, having a polite exchange with an unseen being at a cedar stump. I opened the oven and a wave of heat and flower smell hit me. Blue appeared at my left hip like summoned assistance. You vote option 2, huh? he sneezed. Compelling argument. I wrapped 2 warm biscuits in a dish towel, added a small jar of blackberry jam, and carried them out under my coat. The sleet pinged off the porch rail and hissed in the grass. At the stump, I set everything down and, without planning to, put my palm on the weathered cedar surface. Even trade, I said. Maybe not even, but thanks. When I straightened, I felt watched. Not hunted, not cornered, just accompanied from a small distance, the way blue shadows me from room to room, without needing anything except proximity. I didn't turn on the floodlight that night. I left the porch dim and sat with Blue and a wool blanket while sleet became rain, then froze in thin glass over everything. The orchard clicked and popped as branches took the weight. Somewhere down by the creek, ice cracked like far-off rifle shots. Around 9, Blue rose, walked to the door, came back, then went again, pacing in a narrow strip of porch. Need out? He ignored the yard and stared toward the cedar. You're going to wear a groove. He came and pressed his muzzle into my hand, then nudged my wrist until I stood. So I stood. We both looked into blackness for a full minute, rain ticking from the gutter in a steady metronome. Good night, I said finally, to no one visible. Stay warm. Blue exhaled hard through his nose, approval maybe, and settled at my feet. I slept hard and dreamless for the first time in months. At dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed and metallic. I found the plate empty, biscuit crumbs gone, jam jar clean, and set upside down to dry. Beside it lay a small bunch of yarrow, stems trimmed even, blooms tied with a grass loop. I knew yarrow. My mother called it soldier's plant and kept it hung in the pantry for cuts and nosebleeds and all the small failures of human skin. I held it under my nose, bitter, green, medicinal. Blue, I said, turning the stems in my hand. We are officially corresponding. He wagged but didn't take his eyes off the woods. I brought the yarrow inside and set it in an old jelly glass by the sink. Every time I passed it that morning, I slowed, as if checking it was still real. By 10, the sky darkened again. Weather radio said freezing rain by evening, gusts to 30, possible limbfall. I spent an hour clearing the irrigation ditch behind the chicken run so water could move instead of pooling into an ice trap. Mud sucked at my boots. The shovel rang against hidden stones. Blue supervised from the high side, refusing to come down the slick bank. Smart, I told him. One of us should be. As I hauled the last clump of leaves free, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. My sister, Leah. I answered on speaker and wedged the phone against my shoulder. Hey, you sound out of breath. Because I enjoy suffering, she laughed. You and cardio, finally reconciling? Emergency ditch maintenance, glamorous life. A pause, then, you okay? I looked past the run toward the cedar stump, barely visible through stripped alder and rain haze. Yeah, I said, and realized it was mostly true. Actually, yeah. She heard the difference. Sisters do. Something happen? I thought about saying it all, mushrooms, sweetgrass, the way Blue stood sentry like he'd been entrusted with diplomacy. I pictured the silence on her end while she decided whether I was joking or unraveling. Instead, I said, I made Mum's biscuits last night and didn't burn them. Leah made a soft sound. That's practically a miracle. Don't get used to it. We talked about ordinary things after that. Her son's science project volcano, a leak in her upstairs bathroom, whether I'd mailed the insurance forms. But when we hung up, the old hollow in my chest hadn't come roaring back. For maybe the first time since the funeral, grief wasn't the loudest thing in the room. Curiosity was. Small, stubborn, alive. I spent the afternoon in motion, checked the tractor battery, brought in 2 armloads of split fir, nailed loose flashing above the mudroom window before the weather worsened. At 4, wind came down from the ridge in hard pulses that bent the tops of the firs and shook water from every branch at once. I moved the last feed sacks off the porch and latched the coop. Then I noticed the east pasture gate swinging wrong. It should have been tied shut with a length of baling twine. I'd done it yesterday. Now it rested flush against the post, secured with 3 slender alder switches woven through the hinge loop and crossbar in a neat twist pattern I didn't recognize, but instantly trusted. I grabbed the gate and yanked. It held, better than twine ever did. I crouched and studied the weave, fingertips tracing wet bark. Fresh cut, still green under the surface. Whoever did it had strong hands and patience. "Blue," I called, "come look at this." He came, sniffed once, then sneezed and sat down, looking pleased with me for finally catching up. Rain began again, colder now, stinging the back of my neck. I scanned the pasture edge. Mud everywhere, pocked with hoof marks and my own boot prints. And there, deeper, wider, spaced farther apart than mine, impressions pressed clean into the softened ground leading from tree line to gate and back again. Not bare. Too long in the heel, too narrow at the front. Not boot, unless somebody wore a size impossible and walked barefoot anyway, because there was no tread. Just the shape, clear as a handprint in clay. I followed them with my eyes toward the house. They crossed the yard, skirted the woodpile, and stopped at the boundary of the porch light's usual reach, as if whoever made them had approached and then decided that was close enough. A shiver went through me that had nothing to do with rain. Blue stepped in front of my legs, leaning his shoulder into my shin, gaze fixed on the same spot. No growl, no fear, just that steady attention again. "All right," I said under my breath. Boundary respected. Wind shook the plum tree by the shed, and a shower of droplets rattled down like thrown gravel. I almost laughed from nerves. Back inside, I toweled Blue dry, fed him early, and built a fire big enough to take the damp out of the house. The yarrow by the sink caught the weak kitchen light, pale flowers like tiny stars over the rim of the glass. I touched them as I passed, a habit already forming. At dusk, I cut a pear from the last surviving tree in the orchard, small, mottled, still sweet, and sliced it on my mother's old cutting board. I added a spoon of jam because diplomacy seemed to like jam, and carried the plate out in both hands. The rain had eased to mist. The woods were a dark wall breathing quietly beyond the yard. I set the plate on the cedar stump. "Gate's solid," I said into the trees. "Better than wire." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Blue sat beside me, tail sweeping slow arcs over wet needles. I looked toward the porch, then back to the tree line. "I don't know what the right rules are here," I said, "so I'm trying not to be rude." Nothing moved that I could see. Still, the air changed, the way a room changes when someone steps into it behind you and says nothing. I put my hand over my heart without thinking, a reflex from no religion I currently practiced. "Thank you," I said again, and this time it wasn't apology. It was conversation. The mist held low over the yard, making the porch light look like it was shining through milk. I stood at the cedar stump a few seconds longer after saying, "Thank you," hand still warm where it had touched the wood, then turned back toward the house with Blue at my heel. Halfway to the steps, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. "What now?" I asked. He didn't answer, obviously. He just kept staring into the trees, ears up, body loose. Not warning me, waiting for me. I listened. Rain tapped from branch to branch. Somewhere farther downslope, creek water pushed over rock with that smooth combing sound. No crack of brush, No footfall, nothing dramatic. Still, my skin registered that same subtle shift in the air, like a second person stepping into a room and saying nothing. "We gave thanks," I told him. "That's all we're doing tonight." Blue gave one quiet huff and followed me inside. I dried my boots on the mat, hung my coat, and moved through the kitchen on habit. Rinse mug, stack plates, bank the fire, fill Blue's water bowl. The house smelled like wet wool and wood smoke and jam. Through the sink window, I could see the dark shape of the orchard and, beyond it, the black wall of firs. Every few minutes I caught myself looking out there, forgetting what I was doing. At 8:30, I gave up pretending I was headed to bed and took my mug back out to the porch with a blanket over my shoulders. I left the light off. The moon had climbed behind thin cloud, enough to silver the grass and pick out the wire fence in faint lines. The plum trees near the back path stood bare and narrow, each twig crusted with old ice from the earlier freeze. Blue settled beside me with a grunt, hips hitting the boards harder than they used to. He put his chin on my boot and sighed. "Me too," I said. Time stretched. A branch dropped somewhere in the woods with a soft thud. A gust moved through the upper firs, then died. I watched my own breath cloud and disappear. Nothing happened, and then, because that's usually how it goes, something did. Blue lifted his head all at once, ears pitched forward. Not a bark, not even a growl. Just attention sharpened to a point. I followed his gaze towards the plum trees. At first I thought it was shadow moving against shadow, a trick from cloud passing over moonlight. Then the shape separated itself from the dark, and I saw height where there shouldn't have been height, breadth where there shouldn't have been breadth. A figure stood between the two oldest plums, big enough that the low branches framed it like a doorway. Everything in me went still. It was too tall for any man I knew by a full head and then some. Shoulders wide, torso deep, arms long enough that the hands hung low, even with elbows bent around what looked like a burlap sack. The body was dark, the edges softened by damp air, but moonlight caught on coarse hair along the shoulders and upper arms, frosting it silver. It moved, not fast, not the jerky, startled movement of a deer caught in yard light. It shifted weight with deliberate care, set one foot, paused, set the other. The branches in front of it trembled but didn't snap. Where the ice had glazed thin twigs, it angled around them like somebody carrying a full pot over uneven floorboards, careful not to spill. My hand tightened around the mug until my knuckles hurt. Blue stood up and took one step forward, tail level, nose working. "Easy," I whispered, though I wasn't sure whether I meant him or me. The figure advanced 3 more paces into the orchard lane. I could hear it now, a soft hiss of wet grass bending under weight, a low rustle of sackcloth, one muted click as something hard inside the sack knocked against itself. "Apples," my brain supplied absurdly, filing details while the rest of me failed to catch up. The shape paused at a drooping plum branch and, with impossible gentleness for something that large, lifted the branch with one hand so the sack could pass beneath without knocking fruiting spurs loose. It lowered the branch back exactly where it had been. No hurry, no threat display, no bluff charge, no pacing, no snort. None of the wild warning signs I'd spent half my life reading in woods and pasture. Just care. My coffee had gone cold in my hand, and I hadn't taken a sip in 20 minutes. I don't know how long I watched before I remembered to breathe. Long enough for the moon to edge free of cloud and lay a thin white stripe across the figure's back. Long enough for my rational brain to run through every argument it had. Bear on hind legs, neighbor in ghillie suit, sleep deprivation, grief hallucination, and discard each one as the creature bent, shifted, and stepped with a precision no panicked animal or prankster would bother with. Blue made a soft, whining sound in his throat. Not fear exactly, more like recognition, delayed. "You see it too," I whispered. He thumped his tail once against the porch board without taking his eyes off the orchard. The figure continued toward the house, stopping just beyond where the porch light normally reached, as if it knew the line even in darkness. It stood there with the sack cradled close, head angled slightly down, waiting. For what? I had no idea. For a long second we simply existed in the same cold yard, 3 breathing creatures and a house full of old ghosts. Then Blue glanced up at me and I stood, because sitting felt impossible. The second my weight shifted, the porch board creaked. The figure's head turned toward the sound. I expected, with bone-deep certainty, that this would be the moment it bolted, crashing through brush, vanishing into firs, gone before I could decide whether to be relieved or wrecked. It didn't run. It just looked at me. Moonlight found the face in pieces, brow ridge dark with wet, cheek planes broad, nose flatter than a human nose but shaped, not snout, mouth closed, no bared teeth. Eyes set deep and catching light in a way that looked amber 1 second, brown the next. Calm eyes. Alert, yes, but not wild. My own pulse hammered so hard I could hear it. "Hi," I said, because apparently when confronted with the impossible, I turn into a man greeting someone at a hardware store. The word came out thin. I cleared my throat. I had planned nothing for this. No script, no wise line for the moment the world got bigger than my categories. Blue stepped off the porch and stood at the bottom step, not crossing farther. His tail moved in a slow, loose arc. The figure tracked him with its gaze, then looked back at me. Still no retreat. Disbelief is noisy at first. It throws elbows. It insists on alternatives. I could feel it in real time, my mind hauling up old magazine articles, bad TV footage, every smug sentence I'd ever said about stories made from loneliness. But there was no room left for smugness under that steady gaze. Facts have a physical weight when they're standing in your yard. I took 1 careful step down onto the first stair. "I'm Dean," I heard myself say. "This is Blue." Blue sneezed. I almost laughed from nerves. He's friendlier than I am. The creature remained where it was, shoulders easy, 1 hand still under the sack as if balancing fragile cargo. No crouch, no flare, no sudden jerk. If anything, it looked like it was making itself still on purpose, the way I do with skittish horses. Let them read your shape, your breathing, your intent. Something inside me unclenched at that. "You brought the mushrooms," I said, voice rough. "And the yarrow. Gateweave." I touched my chest with my free hand, then pointed faintly toward the stump. "Thank you." The creature blinked once, slow. Its head dipped a fraction, not exactly a nod, but close enough that my throat tightened. I stayed on the step. Didn't push closer. Didn't reach for my phone in my pocket, though every modern reflex screamed documentation. The moment felt brittle in a way cameras would only shatter. Wind moved through the orchard carrying wet leaf smell and distant creek-cold air. Somewhere a branch tapped twice against the shed roof. My mug trembled in my hand and spilled a little onto my knuckles. I didn't feel the heat. Blue sat down exactly where he stood, old dog joints folding with effort, and rested there like we were waiting for church doors to open. The creature looked at him again, longer this time. I saw its nostrils flare, testing scent. 1 corner of its mouth softened. Not smile, not human expression exactly, but an easing. "He's 13, I said, absurdly conversational. "Acts younger when food's involved." If this was madness, It was remarkably specific. The creature shifted the sack slightly higher with both hands and took one step to its left, bringing itself clear of a brittle plum branch. It did not break eye contact while moving. Then it paused as if checking whether that motion had unsettled us. I shook my head once. "You're okay." It resumed breathing I could now hear faintly in the quiet. Deep, even pulls through cold air. Wonder arrived without fanfare. It just replaced disbelief the way dawn replaces dark. Gradual, until suddenly obvious. I wasn't being tested. I wasn't being toyed with. I was being met. Seen from across a boundary both of us understood and neither of us crossed. For years I had wanted one impossible proof for reasons I'd barely admitted to myself. Not proof of monsters, not proof of magic. Proof that I hadn't inherited an empty world by insisting everything tender was stupid. Standing on that step, watched without fear by a being I had spent 3 years feeding an apology, I felt something old and rigid in me give way. "Okay," I whispered. "I believe you." Blue's tail thumped once like punctuation. The creature lowered its gaze first, not submissive, simply practical, and turned slightly toward the porch corner where I keep the dry mat for muddy boots. Then I understood the weight in its arms. The burlap sack was swollen round in places, narrow in others. Fruit-sized shapes pressed against the weave. When it shifted, I caught the scent. Clean, tart, unmistakable. Apples. Windfalls, not dumped, gathered. It moved forward 2 careful steps, each one placed between slick stones where even I sometimes slide. At the edge of the mat it crouched, knees bending deep, and set the sack down with such control that not a single apple thudded. A soft, nested rustle. That was all. Blue stood, tail wagging wider now, and leaned forward to sniff. The creature waited until Blue finished, then withdrew its hand so slowly the dog didn't startle. "Those are from the North Row," I said before I could stop myself. "They dropped this afternoon." The creature turned its head towards the orchard, then back to me, as if confirming. North Row apples were the last decent keepers on the property. Small, ugly, perfect for sauce. Every year I told myself I'd gather them before rains split the skins. Every year weather beat me to half of them. Tonight I'd seen the storm coming and figured I'd lose the lot by morning. It had gone and gathered them for me. My vision went blurry all at once. I took another step down, stopping 2 stairs above the yard. "You did that for me?" The creature didn't answer in words. It reached to the sack mouth, folded the top back, and revealed fruit stacked stem up in neat layers. Leaves cushioned the bottom. Bruised apples had been separated to one side in a smaller pocket of cloth, tied off from the good ones so rot wouldn't spread. No accident, no random scavenging. This was work done with intention and knowledge. I made a broken sound that might have been a laugh. "Mum would have approved your sorting system," I said, wiping my face with the heel of my hand before tears could freeze there. She hated bruises in with keepers. At my words, the creature's eyes flicked toward the kitchen window where her old curtain still hung. It held that look a beat too long for coincidence. Then, with one large hand, it touched the cedar post at the corner of the porch, open palm, brief and gentle, like a person greeting a threshold. My breath caught. Blue pressed against my shin, leaning hard enough that I had to widen my stance. He looked up at the creature, then back at me, then gave a soft, eager chuff. "You want to say thanks?" I asked him. He wagged harder. I crouched slowly, joints popping, and took one apple from the top of the sack. Cool skin, beads of mist, no bruise. I held it up, chest high. "Thank you," I said, steadier now, "for all of it." The creature watched my hand, then my face. That same fractional head dip, almost a nod. No fear, no demand, just acknowledgement. Then it straightened to full height, taller than the porch roofline's lower edge, shoulders broad enough to block half the moon, and stepped backward 3 paces, never turning its back until distance felt polite again. At the plum trees it angled sideways to pass between branches without snapping one, even now, even leaving. Care to the end. At the tree line it paused. I thought, irrationally, that it might be waiting for some formal dismissal, the way guests linger at a doorway, so I said the only thing that felt right. "Good night, neighbour." It stood very still a beat, then vanished into the fir dark, with less sound than I make crossing my own kitchen. The yard seemed enormous after it left, empty but not lonely. I stayed on the steps with Blue pressed to my leg and the apple in my hand until the cold pushed through my jeans and into bone. Finally, I lifted the sack by its tied handles, heavier than I expected, 20 pounds at least, and carried it inside. In the kitchen, I set it on the table under the yellow light. Blue sat beside it like a guard. I untied the smaller side pocket and found the bruised fruit separated exactly as I'd seen. Sauce apples together, keepers pristine. On top of the keepers lay a single narrow twig, woven into a loop, alder green and damp, same pattern as the gate latch. A signature. I laughed again, quiet this time, and looked toward my mother's photograph in the next room. "You were right," I told her, "about manners, about neighbours, about all of it." Blue rested his chin on my knee. I scratched behind his ears, still staring at the sack of apples on the table like it might dissolve if I blinked too long. It didn't dissolve. Neither did the feeling that came with it. Not the sharp ache of apology anymore, but something steadier, stranger, better. I turned off the kitchen light, left the porch dark, and before heading to bed, I sliced 1 apple into thin moons, half for me, half for Blue, and set a fresh plate on the cedar stump. The next day broke hard and white. Frost glazed over last night's rain, every fence wire strung with ice that flashed when the sun tried to come through. The sack of apples sat on my table like proof I was afraid to disturb. I made sauce from the bruised ones, standing at the stove with cinnamon and steam in my face, and kept looking out the window toward the cedar stump. Blue stayed close all morning. Not anxious, just glued to me, old shoulder bumping my calf every time I stopped moving. By noon, the weather radio started its flat-voiced warnings. Freezing rain advisory in effect from 1600 hours. Rapid accumulation possible. Avoid travel. Yeah, I muttered, tightening the coop latch with numb fingers. Nobody's going anywhere. The sky had that metallic look, low and smooth, the colour of a shovel blade. I hauled another tarp to the chicken run, dragged cinder blocks to hold it, and checked the irrigation ditch again where I'd cleared it yesterday. Water already moved faster than it should, thin and brown, carrying oak leaves in little spinning fleets. Blue stood up on the bank and watched me, tail low, ears flicking at each gust. "Stay up there," I told him. "No heroics." He yawned theatrically. Back at the house, I found the old red wool blanket in the hall closet, the one my mother used every winter on Blue when he was a pup, too stubborn to come in from snow. It smelled faintly of cedar and old detergent. One corner was darned where he'd chewed it years ago. I shook it out and draped it over the porch chair to air while I went back for the last feed bucket. By 3:30, sleet had started, small, hard pellets ticking off the roof. By 4, it turned to freezing rain. Everything got loud and muffled at the same time. The ping on metal, the hiss through cedar boughs, the heavy silence underneath. I was bent over the chicken run, fingers clumsy with cold as I wrestled tarp edges into place, when I heard Blue yelp. Not bark, not his annoyed old man grumble. A sharp, surprised sound that cut right through weather noise. I spun. He was on the ditch bank behind the run, paws scrambling on mud gone slick as soap. His hind legs slid out from under him. For one suspended second, he looked right at me, eyes wide. Then his body rolled and he went down the embankment into the ditch water. Blue! I dropped the tarp and ran. My boots hit the slope and kept going. I caught a post and nearly tore my shoulder out. Cold water was already up to Blue's chest, current pinning him sideways against a tangle of roots. He tried to climb, front paws clawing mud, but his hips failed and he slipped back with a choking gasp. "Stay! Stay!" I yelled, like command could fix old joints. I went down on one knee, reached for his collar, missed by inches. Mud sheared away under my weight, and I slid another foot. One leg in the ditch now, freezing water punching breath out of me. Blue's eyes found mine. He made a sound I'd never heard from him, small and helpless. "No, no, no, no." I lunged again and the bank collapsed under my hands. Water shoved against my shins, stronger than it looked. If I went fully in, we were both stuck. Panic doesn't feel dramatic when it arrives. It feels stupidly practical. Angles, grip, weight, time. I remember thinking, I am about to lose him because I cannot get 6 more inches. "Help!" I shouted at nobody, at rain, at trees, at everything I'd mocked and then begged. "Please, please, help me!" The word was barely out when the fir shadows above the ditch changed. A shape moved between trunks, fast now, none of last night's measured pace. He came down the slope in 3 long strides that should have sent any creature skidding, but each foot found purchase. One hand caught a sapling, the other reached past me into the ditch. Blue didn't snap, didn't flail away. He went still. The tall neighbor dropped to one knee in mud and water, as if it weighed nothing, slid both hands under Blue's chest and hindquarters, and lifted him clean in one motion. Not hauled by the collar, not yanked. Lifted, close, secure. Blue tucked against that broad chest with his head over one shoulder, like something precious and breakable. I scrambled backward out of the ditch on all 4s, coughing, half blind with rain. "Porch," I gasped, pointing. "Please, porch." He was already moving. He climbed the bank with Blue held high against freezing spray, one arm shielding the dog's face from sleet. Up past the run, across the yard that had become a skin of ice over mud, straight to my back steps. He ducked under the eave without brushing it, crossed to the driest mat by the mudroom vent where warm air leaked, and knelt. When he laid Blue down, he kept one hand under Blue's ribs until all 4 paws were settled. Then he withdrew slowly so the dog wouldn't startle. Blue shivered violently, teeth clicking. I stumbled onto the porch, soaked through, one glove gone, hands shaking so hard I couldn't get purchase on the door handle. Inside, buddy, come on." Before I could crouch, the tall neighbor turned away and stepped back into the rain. "Wait," I choked out. "Where?" He crossed the porch in 2 quiet steps, stopped at the chair near the rail, and picked up the red wool blanket I'd forgotten there. Rain had darkened it almost maroon. He shook it once, gentle, just enough to open it, then came back and draped it over Blue from shoulders to tail with an exactness that wrecked me. Tucking the frayed corner under Blue's chest, the same way my mother used to so drafts couldn't creep in. The sight hit like a rib cracked open. I dropped to my knees on wet boards. The cold went straight through denim, but I barely felt it. I cried, not pretty, not controlled, the kind that comes from somewhere below language. I bent over with my palms on the boards and sobbed for my mother. For the hospital room smell I still couldn't forget. For the last stupid sentence I ever said to her. For 3 years of talking tough and feeling hollow. For every time I'd treated tenderness like an embarrassment until grief taught me better. "I'm sorry," I said into my hands, to her, to him, to Blue, to the whole soaked world. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Blue pushed his nose under my wrist and licked salt and rain from my knuckles. I looked up through blurred vision. The tall neighbor stood 3 feet away, rain beading on dark hair and running in lines down his forearms. He wasn't looming. He wasn't performing concern. Just there, still and steady, giving me the same space you give somebody trying to breathe. Thank you, I managed, voice shredded. Thank you for him. His eyes moved to Blue, then back to me. Slow blink, a tiny incline of the head. I sat back on my heels, chest heaving, and laughed once through tears because there was nothing else to do. She used that blanket every winter, I said, touching the damp wool. My mom. She said old dogs need ceremony. Wind shoved a sheet of rain under the eave. He angled his body, broad shoulder taking it, between the weather and Blue for one brief second like a living wall. Then he stepped away. No flourish, no lingering for praise. He turned toward the yard, paused beside the cedar stump at the tree line, and placed his open palm on its weathered top, just once. Then he walked into the fir dark and was gone. I don't know how long I sat there with my hand on Blue's ribs, feeling them flutter and settle and flutter again. Eventually, training and panic burned off into action. I got us both inside, toweled Blue dry as best I could, switched on the space heater, called the emergency vet 30 miles out. Keep him warm, the vet tech said over static. Small sips of water. Watch gum color. If breathing gets shallow, you come in, regardless of weather. Got it. I wrapped Blue in the red blanket and sat on the kitchen floor beside him while sleet hammered the windows. He was shivering less now, eyes half closed, one paw resting on my boot. Don't you do that to me again, I whispered. You hear me? You don't. His tail thumped under wool, weak but definite. Good. I made broth from chicken stock and cooled it. He drank a little from my cupped hand. I changed out of soaked clothes, then changed his blanket when the first one got damp. Every hour I checked his gums, counted breaths, listened to weather and house creaks and his old dog's snore when it finally came. Near midnight, when he was stable and dozing, I took a bowl of warm applesauce to the back door and stepped under the eave. Rain had eased to a fine mist. The yard shone black and silver under a breaking cloud. I walked to the cedar stump with the bowl steaming in my hands. Don't know if this is your kind of food, I said softly, setting it down. But it seemed right. I touched the top of the stump where his palm had rested. The wood was still slightly warmer than the rain around it. Probably my imagination. I didn't care. Thank you, I said again. For Blue, for tonight, for all of it. No answer except creek water and the distant crack of ice sliding off a limb. It was enough. Back inside, I slept on the kitchen floor with Blue's blanket bunched under my shoulder and woke at dawn to his nose in my ear and the steady sound of rain finally turning back to plain water. Morning light came thin and pearl grey through the curtains. Blue stood stiffly, did a full-body shake, then looked offended at the concept of weakness and walked to his bowl. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. Breakfast it is, miracle dog. He ate half, drank, and went back to his blanket by the vent. At the stump, the bowl was clean, set upside down. Beside it lay nothing this time. No herb, no weave, no gift bundle. Just rain-dark cedar and one broad, faint print in the wet duff, leading toward the trees before it dissolved under dripping branches. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, listening. Good morning, neighbour, I said to the woods. Wind moved through the fir tops in one long exhale. I didn't ask for anything. By late February, the freeze had broken for good. Snow retreated to high shade. The ditch ran loud and honest. Mud season took over, and with it came work. Not estate settling work, staying work. One bright, cold Saturday, I drove into town with Blue on the passenger seat and stopped at the feed store. Same woman at the register, same cracked bell over the door. "Dean Murray," she said, scanning a roll of orchard wire and a sack of seed potatoes. "You still just settling things?" I set 2 bare root apple starts on the counter, their roots wrapped in damp burlap. "No, Mum," I said. "I'm planting." She smiled like she'd expected that answer 3 years ago. At the county office, I signed the form withdrawing the property sale inquiry I'd filed and never acted on. The clerk slid the paper toward me. "Sure you don't want to keep options open?" he asked. I thought of cedar stump, red blanket, a giant hand tucking wool around an old dog. "I'm sure." When I got home, Leah was waiting in the driveway with her kid's booster seat still strapped in back and a box of mason jars in her trunk. She got out, took one look at me carrying saplings, and put her hands on her hips. "Well, look at you. Don't start." "I'm not starting. I'm witnessing." Blue hobbled down the porch steps to greet her. She knelt and rubbed his ears, then frowned at the stiffness in his hind legs. "He okay?" "Had a scare in the storm," I said. "He's tough." Leah looked up sharply. "What kind of scare?" I hesitated. Then I told her the true part she could hold. "Fell in the ditch. I couldn't get to him fast enough, but we got him out." "We?" I met her eyes. "Had help." She studied my face a long moment, the way sisters do when they know there's a deeper layer, and decide not to pry it open with a crowbar. She squeezed my wrist once. "I'm glad you had help." We spent the afternoon in the orchard, old stumps like rotten teeth, new holes cut beside them. Leah worked the shovel while I set rootstock, spreading roots over mounded soil like fingers. Her son Milo carried water in a plastic dinosaur bucket and took his job with solemn pride. "What are their names?" he asked, patting a stake after we tied the first tree. "Names?" "Trees need names." Leah laughed. "He's not wrong." I looked toward the tree line. "Okay," I said, "this one's June. That one's Rosen. That one—" I glanced at Blue sprawled in a sun patch, red blanket over his hips like a king's robe. "That one's Blue." Milo approved. When the last sapling was in, Leah and I stood with muddy boots at the edge of the yard and looked at the row. "It looks like a beginning," she said. "Feels like one." She leaned into my shoulder. Mom would be insufferably pleased. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I know." Before she left, she handed me the box from her trunk. "Found these in my garage, Mum's jam jars. Figured you'd use them." I opened the flaps, clean glass, old metal lids, one label in my mother's handwriting. Blackberry, 2019. My throat tightened, but not in the old, drowning way. "Thanks, Leah." She kissed my cheek. "Call me if you need anything. And by anything I mean help, not another near hypothermic dog story." Deal. That evening, I simmered the last freezer berries with sugar and lemon peel until the kitchen smelled like August. Filled 6 jars, sealed 5. The 6th didn't ping, so I put it straight in the fridge and took a spoonful out to Blue on the porch. "Doctor says no sugar," I told him, letting him lick the tiniest taste from my finger. "Don't tell." At dusk, I sliced bread, added a spoon of fresh jam, and walked to the cedar stump. The air had softened. Frogs were starting up down by the creek. New grass shone in damp patches where ice had killed the old. I set the plate down and stood with my hands open at my sides. "No emergencies tonight," I said quietly. "Just gratitude." I listened a while, breathing wet earth and budding alder. A branch moved at the tree line. Not dramatic, just enough to show something large passing deep between trunks. I didn't call out, didn't step forward. We had our boundary. We had our manners. "Good night, neighbor," I said. Then I went back to the house where lights glowed warm in windows I had decided to keep, where an old dog snored under a red blanket, where my mother's photograph watched from the sewing room dresser while jam cooled on the counter and mud dried on my boots. I still leave food at the cedar stump, not to prove anything now, not to bargain, not to be forgiven. I leave it because care answered me, and I finally learned how to answer back.